Chapter 106, Titus, Antony's POV. Antony rode mechanically. The cuts on his lower back burned with a steady intensity, but it wasn't so bad. It helped him keep floating. It helped keep him together. The group in the rowboat was small, each chosen for a particular reason. Theo and Marcus were his lieutenants. He asked Iovita in case he had need of their diplomacy, and Julia in case he needed her medical skills. Felix was there as well, to provide both advice and muscle, and Sinisa was just muscle. He was unlikely to speak out of turn or cause an incident, and that was good enough for Antony's purposes. At least, he hoped it would be. How could he be sure what his purposes were when he knew nothing about the situation? Just so long as Titus is alive. He knew Theodora was looking at him, and he avoided her gaze. That was one of the reasons he'd insisted on claiming one of the oars. This way, he could avoid any attempts at conversation. In particular, he could avoid Theo. She wouldn't understand. She was so strong, so competent. How could he tell her that he needed to be injured just so he could keep it together and pretend to be a competent leader instead of a panicky brother? I've got no knack for leadership. The thought was usually painful and humiliating, but in the moments when he floated, Antony could admit it to himself. If I ever did, it's long gone, but I don't think it was there to begin with. Claudia had brains, I had charisma, Theodora had a conscience, and once he grew up, Titus could intimidate. Together, we made a single functioning leader. But after that night, Theo has grown up since then, but I think she's the only one. Claudia's strategizing turned cold, Titus grew ruthless, and now that we're separated, all we can do is float around, killing time for the rest of eternity. Another thought followed this one, dulled and bearable, but no less insistent for all that. We never should have split up. There were ropes dangling from the side of the ship, and Antony scrambled up one as soon as it came within reach. It was probably rude to leave the boat rocking and everyone else to secure it, but he couldn't help himself. He knew he was unlikely to find anything pleasant, but nothing could be worse than the uncertainty. Someone leaned over the lower deck to help him up once he drew near. It was Titus's second, Massima. She was sturdy and grim-faced, a former general from a long military line who had found herself ousted from his father's army when she feuded with the consort. She had joined their schemes out of a grim desire to see her enemy punished and help the aged father whom she worshipped feel that his family's honor had been restored. The one time Antony had spoken with her when she was drunk and in a sharing mood, she had slurred that she would never forgive herself for the pain she'd caused the old soldier with her foolishness, that she would risk anything to make him proud of her again. Then she had been cursed and tore her father's throat out. "You're a welcome sight, Lord Antony," she said as she hoisted him over the side. The touch of her rough hand broke the spell. Antony felt himself slam back into his body with a violent, sickening lurch that somehow happened only in his mind. This was real. He was touching Massima, touching Titus's crew and Titus's ship. He was about to learn his brother's fate. Marcus's assistance had brought him this far, but he would have to handle the news on his own. He mourned the sense of distance as he steadied himself on the deck, trying not to show how rattled he suddenly felt. If he lost control, there would be plenty of witnesses. Massima wasn't the only one there to greet him. Dozens of vampires were crowded onto the lower deck, huddled in groups and staring at Antony. It must have been almost everyone in his brother's crew. He glanced over their familiar faces, noting their grim expressions, noting his brother's conspicuous absence. Theodora scrambled over the railing and planted herself next to him. God, she must have been truly frantic to trust their dinghy to someone else's knots. Massima was still talking. "We didn't have any way to contact you, but we hoped that if we stayed here long enough, either you or Lord Claudia would come by eventually." "What happened?" Theodora growled, her voice tight. "Where is he? Is he alive?" "Yes," replied Massima. The lightening of Antony's terror was like a physical weight being lifted from him. He pulled in a breath he didn't need just to feel it in his suddenly functional lungs. He felt, and then pushed away, a ridiculous urge to fling himself into Hanyu's arms. That was stupid. Hanyu wasn't even there. He needed to keep himself together. Theodora slumped beside him, breath hitching over what sounded like a sob. Antony was about to lean into her when Iovita popped over the edge, then Julia, then Marcus. The sight of their tension reminded him that alive only meant so much, especially when Titus was so conspicuously absent. "Once the rest of my people join us, I'd like to speak with my brother," Antony announced, trying to keep his voice steady. Massima sighed. "I'll take you to see him. If he actually speaks with you, we'll throw a fucking party. He's stopped, Lord Antony." "Stopped what?" Antony snapped. When she met his eyes, her gaze was tired and cold. She'd never been especially personable. He'd been a little afraid of her even before the curse. Ever since that night, though, he'd often had the unsettling feeling that there was no one living behind her eyes anymore. She was efficient, competent, and utterly empty. Now, though, she seemed faintly annoyed, or perhaps pitying. "Everything," she said, enunciating each syllable as if he were hard of hearing. "Come on." Felix and Sinisa had clambered up as well, so there was no reason to wait any longer. Antony followed Massima, more grateful than ever for the blessed sensation of floating that had let him keep his veneer of dignity and calm so long. It was much harder to keep himself together now that it was gone. As if sensing his gratitude, Marcus slipped up beside him and took his hand. Antony squeezed his big fingers and relished the familiarity of his lover's hand in his. "He's with me. He helped me so I could face this, and he's supporting me through it. No one else has to understand. Who cares about the little day-to-day difficulties? He's there for me when it counts. It's enough." He was dimly aware of Julia, Felix, and the others clustering around Theodora, whispering to her and to each other, but he couldn't focus on any of it. He couldn't even focus on Marcus's hand in his, past that first grateful flash. All he could think of was Massima's choice of word. Everything. They went up from the lower deck, but only by a single short set of stairs. Then they were in a long hallway with doors on either side, and for some reason, it took Antony a long moment to realize that it was the residential area. It was so still. He squeezed Marcus's hand without meaning to do it, and his lover gently squeezed back. Finally, Massima opened a door. Antony dropped Marcus's hand so he could follow the former general into the room. He found himself in a sparse, poorly lit space. Titus had never found much taste for art or decoration, and that clearly hadn't changed. The only furniture was a small, rickety-looking desk and a large, soft chair piled with blankets. Weapons hung on the walls in place of paintings or tapestries. There was a shelf, but it was mostly bare. An older man with a drawn face dropped to the floor as soon as they entered. Antony realized with a start that he was the first human he'd seen on this vessel. Shock was short-lived, quickly giving way to his horror that what he'd taken for a heap of blankets on the chair was in fact his brother. "Titus!" Theodora flew past him, dropping to her knees in front of the chair and grabbing blindly for his hands among the blankets. Antony moved forward more slowly, unable to take his eyes from his brother's face. His relief curdled inside him, sick dread taking its place. Titus stared straight ahead, and he looked perfectly normal. Of course he did. Their horrible, timeless bodies always looked fine, no matter what. But he wasn't blinking, and he didn't respond to Theodora's touches or cries. He'd been struggling for a while. Massima's matter-of-fact tone felt inappropriate. Antony didn't know why he thought that she should have been speaking in a lowered voice, but he did. Depressed, lethargic, whining about what's the point and all. Happens to plenty of us, I suppose. But I never thought he'd just let himself stop like this. Julia broke in, asking questions in that sharp, competent tone that usually soothed Antony and let him believe that she knew how to fix everything. Right now, though, he couldn't listen to any of it. He'd finally reached his brother's side. Antony reached out a hand. It shook like a sow's, like Titus's, like the hand of his perfect little baby brother who had been so small, so needy, so afraid to disappoint anyone, who had worshipped Theodora like a god before any of them took on the title, and would never fail to react to her presence. "But he'll respond to me. I'm his brother. We came into the birthing room and it smelled like a battlefield, though we didn't know that yet. blood and every other substance a body can hold, and Mother was in bed, and she beckoned us over and smiled, even though she was so pale. I looked, and I saw his hand sticking out of the wrappings, and it was the littlest, fragilest thing in the world, with nails no bigger than a grain of rice, and I touched my finger to his palm to compare, and his fingers twitched a bit, as if they might curl around it. That was the first time I touched him. Surely, if I touch him now... But Titus didn't move when Julia checked him over, or when Theo cried at his feet, and he didn't even blink when Antony's shaking hand touched his cheek. Time swirled past in a blur. It could have been hours or only minutes later when Theodora snapped her fingers under his nose, drawing his gaze away from Titus's face so he could stare mutely at her. "We're taking him with us," she informed him, her eyes blazing. "I'm not leaving him like this." Antony glanced toward the place where Massima had been standing when he was last aware of her. She hadn't moved far, which indicated that he hadn't been standing there staring for hours. Small blessings. "I've no objections," the former general said. "Camillus never claimed to be a healer of Julia's caliber. I'm sure he'll be glad to hand his patient over to someone with a better chance of success." Julia only nodded, expressionless. Gods, that scared Antony. Ordinarily, she would soak up compliments to her skill and preen over them. This stolidness boded poorly. Marcus put a hand on his shoulder and murmured in his ear, "There will be a lot to get ready, darling. I'll go back to the ship and let everyone know what's going on, and we'll begin coordinating trips to the island for supplies, while you all sort things out here." Antony nodded dumbly, but his mind was beginning to work again. He seized gratefully on the idea. After all this time, finally, there was something concrete he could do to try to help Titus. It wasn't much of a relief, or much of a plan, but it was a damn sight better than nothing. He threw his arms around his lover, too lost in a wave of appreciation to worry about Massima's unimpressed gaze on them. "Thank you," he whispered in Marcus's ear, voice shaking with all the emotions that rioted through him. "I don't deserve you. Thank you for always being the one I can trust." Marcus pressed a kiss to the top of his head. The touch seemed to linger just a bit longer than usual, as if he sensed how badly Antony needed his strength and his reassurance. Then he pulled away and left the room, stepping over the human who still bowed, silent and ignored, on the floor. Antony tried to gather the shreds of himself together. "We can do this. We can help him. We can save him." Massima sighed. "I hope you have some spare humans. He killed over a dozen right before this started, and we're running a bit low."